This is how trade policy can help achieve the UK's environmental ambitions. We are in the middle of a three-part odyssey. Greener UK is going through the whole gamut of environmental policy. Yesterday, we had an event with the Secretary of State, George Eustace. On Thursday, there's a session with Professor Dasgupta talking about the type of economy that avoids a nature crisis. And today is trade, very much the topic of the moment. We know about the risks to the environment from trade. We've seen the NFU petition. We've had the headlines about chlorinated chicken. So we know the risks of getting environmental policy wrong, offshoring your emissions, all the difficulties around negotiating with countries that want to reach into your political domestic space. And we're going to cover all that, I'm sure, but we also want to talk about the chances of doing trade in a way that can contribute to your environmental objectives. What happens when you get it right? How high environmental standards can raise production standards around the world, how we can reorientate our economy to sell expertise on low carbon industries of the future, and how taking responsibility for our global footprint can help build resilient supply chains that reduce the risks of climate crisis, nature crisis, and potentially a future health crisis. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to encourage you to submit questions. You can do that using the Q&A function. You're also free to chat during the discussion, that's very welcome. But if you want a question to be given to the speakers, you need to put it in the Q&A function, and please upvote questions that you want to be asked. If you'd like to tweet during the event, please use the hashtag #GreenerUKEvent. So really encourage you to get involved because we've got two great speakers. I'm delighted to be joined by the Minister of Trade, Trade Policy at DTI, Greg Hands, who joined DIT in 2016. And when I checked this last night, I think that makes him the longest serving minister, trade minister in the short history of recent history of international trade. I think he's our longest serving trade minister. And Carolyn Deere Birkbeck, who is international trade guru. I won't list all her affiliations because there are many, but University of Oxford, Graduate Institute in Geneva, and the Chatham House I will mention because she's doing some work with WWF, which is on looking at how international trade can support sustainable production, very relevant for today. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to the Minister for his opening remarks, and then Caroline will share her thoughts. And then we're going to go into questions, and then I'm going to open up to the audience. So I'm looking forward to a really exciting debate. This is the first time DIT have done an event particularly on the environment, and we're very happy to have Minister of State with us today. Minister, over to you.
Well, thank you, Angela, and thank you so much for having me today. It's an honour and a privilege to be with you this morning, and thanks to the Greener UK, the Green Alliance, for inviting me to join the discussion today. And thank you, Angela, for that introduction. Now, there's an important, you're right, I was one of the founding ministers of the new Department for International Trade in July 2016. But there was an interregnum, if you like, in between. I was out of the department for 18 months because, as many of you will know, I resigned from the government in June 2018. And in fact, I'm the only government minister, I believe, ever to have resigned from any government over environmental policy. And this was about the expansion of Heathrow Airport, which is obviously also quite a big constituency interest for my Chelsea and Fulham constituents. So I was here at the foundation, and then I was out for 18 months and rejoined the department in February of this year. And it's great to be back. I mean, I love trade, I love the environment. So it's a great pleasure to be with you here today, where the two issues, the intersection, if you like, between the two issues. So let me just say, first of all, that the UK is a bold leader, a proud leader in bold climate change action, both domestically and internationally. Not only were we the first major economy to legislate for net zero emissions by 2050, but we have cut our CO2 emissions faster since 1990 than any other major world economy. And actually what we've done there is remarkable achievement. I left university in 1989. And I remember people saying, well, you can't improve the environment unless you stop the economy from growing. And actually it was a real thing. I think in the 1989 MEP elections, I think the Green Party ran on a platform of zero growth as the only way to address the environment. And actually, we've shown since then that it is perfectly possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce our environmental footprint, while still being able to grow the economy. And that, I think, is not an either or, that we can do both. And the UK has shown it more conclusively than I think any other major economy since 1990. But our aspirations don't stop there. We remain committed to upholding the UK's high environmental standards as we have left the European Union, and as such have doubled, for example, our international climate finance to £11.6 billion over the next 5 years. And that's a huge amount of money. The amount of money spent on overseas development assistance is round about 13 to 15 billion. So 11.6 billion over the next 5 years. That is a lot of money. And while the Secretary of State for International Trade, Liz Truss, took up the UK's new independent seat at the World Trade Organization in March, she made clear in her address our aim to take the lead in tackling climate change. So the next 18 months are absolutely critical for our planet and our progress towards the goal of keeping mean temperature rises well below 2%. So we are looking very much forward to next year, the UK's presidency of the G7 and of COP26, postponed, of course, from this year due to coronavirus, as a way of the UK taking leadership on the global stage on these matters. I mentioned coronavirus, and of course, it is undoubtedly the biggest health and economic threat that this country has faced for some time, and we've all seen its devastating impact. But trade is going to be an important part of our recovery from COVID, improving the resilience of our supply chains and opening up new markets for British exporters, bringing investment, jobs and lower prices and a better choice of goods for our people, and providing the lifelines our businesses need right now, as well as the trading opportunities tomorrow. But as I've said before, and I'll keep saying, trade doesn't have to come at the expense of the environment. The two are not mutually exclusive. We can trade more, and we can also reduce our environmental footprint at the same time. So we see strong trade policy as a powerful vehicle to help us towards achieving our environmental ambitions. We're also working on revised export and investment strategies this autumn, coming out of Department of International Trade. So I'd be keen to hear your views on how we can support sustainable exports and bring in sustainable investment as well. We already boast world-leading expertise in a lot of these important areas, anything from green finance to offshore wind. I'm really proud of some of the decisions I took in government when I was a Treasury on making sure that the UK's regime for offshore wind was one of the most competitive in the world. And we now have the world's largest offshore wind capacity. And that's an incredible achievement. The UK, number one on offshore wind anywhere in the world. And we're now actually exporting that capability to markets around the world. And that is a great thing for us to be doing. And sharing expertise with partners and accelerating the global transition to a low carbon economy. So it is vital that we have the right business support, promotion and financing in place. And that is why the Department for International Trade has established a dedicated clean growth unit to drive activity and support the low carbon economy across all sectors. The unit will be supported by our network of experts, both here in the UK and internationally, who will be working hard to promote strategic investment into clean sectors. And in terms of financing, our world-leading credit agency, UK Export Finance, is proactively developing the breadth of its support for renewable sectors, even as I speak. Recent projects approved by UKEF range from a £230 million of finance guarantees for one of Asia's largest offshore wind farms in Taiwan. Something when I visited Taiwan in September 2016, led the discussions there on how Taiwan, which of course is a very modern, very developed economy, can tap into UK expertise on offshore wind. It was actually, the meeting was actually held during a hurricane, which felt slightly ironic on a particular day when there was actually too much wind, shall we put it that way. But actually, Taiwan, particularly on the west coast, has got great potential for offshore wind. And the UK has an ability now with our offshore wind expertise to provide expertise for Taiwan. Also, we provided £47 million facility for 2 solar plants in Spain, and this is in terms of export finance as well, again, UK expertise. Another £2 billion allocated at the spring 2020 budget will further both UKEF, UK Export Finance Lending Facility for clean growth and renewable energy projects, and that's another £2 billion available in that space. And we've also allocated additional funding for export finance managers to help businesses in Scotland and the North East to support clean growth exports right across the UK. Back in May, we published our UK global tariff. This will be the rate that the UK charges of tariffs on imports coming into the country from the 1st of January. Up until that point, we're still subject to the European Union's common external tariff. Broadly speaking, the UK global tariff liberalises, simplifies and greens the EU's tariff schedule. We raised the proportion of UK exports that are tariff-free from around 80% to around 89%. And we've also simplified that tariff schedule. And we've also made it a lot greener. We've reduced or removed entirely tariffs from more than 100 different products that back renewable energy, energy efficiency, carbon capture, and to champion the circular economy through recycling and reducing single-use plastic. So removing tariffs from anything from steam turbines through to reducing tariffs on other environmental goods is a key part of that UK global tariff. And of course, we're supporting climate change and sustainability objectives through our new independent trade policy. Our free trade agreement talks, as well as wider engagement, can be a valuable tool in supporting a resilient and green international recovery. For example, through the US, Australia, New Zealand FTAs, we're pursuing a range of provisions that will support the government's climate change and clean growth aims, include promoting trade in low carbon goods and services, securing market access and removing trade barriers for low carbon sectors, and supporting R&D collaboration for low carbon technologies. So in all of our trade agreements, what we're looking for is fair, reciprocal and access, and ultimately that's in the best interest of the British people and the British economy. And it of course means protecting our high environmental standards, animal welfare and food safety. My party's manifesto in December was absolutely clear: no compromise on our environmental, food safety and animal welfare standards in our trade agreements. So that's where we are. That's a quick canter through most aspects of the Department for International Trade, exports, investment, export finance, and the free trade agreement agenda, and our tariff policy. But it's all part of our objective to build back from after the crisis bolder, better and greener. And as we look forward to COP26 next year, I think you'll see the UK playing a major and leading role internationally to make sure that not only the UK is doing the right things, but that we are leading the global debate on combating climate change and reducing our environmental footprint. Thank you very much indeed. Very happy to, I think I'm handing over to Caroline now, and then I think it'll be open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you for those opening remarks. If I just follow up on one question before I hand over to Caroline. You mentioned the undoubted success story of offshore wind and the role of Treasury in that, building up a domestic industry and then it becoming an export success. I wonder, I had my own experience working for the Foreign Office in Latin America, Caribbean region, and saw the prosperity team's work and all the work of selling not only the industry, but the UK's domestic electricity reform into Mexico, into Latin America as part of the way we decarbonise. How are you thinking about not just the export, but the industries we build in the UK and how that connects to trade policy? Because one of the things I think people are really interested in is understanding how we use trade policy to ensure that we build those successful decarbonisation industries and then have the ability to sell them around the world. Energy is an easy one, but some of the ones are quite a bit harder are things like sustainable agriculture, which I know is a challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Thank you for the work that you did. It may have been under our excellent Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for Latin America, Joe Crellin. And we've got great teams across Latin America pursuing these policy objectives. Latin America is a very interesting part of the world for DIT because there's relatively smaller interest from the Foreign Office and there's very little DFID money spent in Latin America means that DIT in many ways is kind of the lead-facing department in that whole region, and that brings opportunities for us. I think two things to say. First of all, in terms of free trade agreements are not the be-all and end-all of trade. They can assist, they can help, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in due course, but you can do a lot on trade agreements in relation to the environment with willing partners. New Zealand is a classic case where actually the environmental aspects of our talks with New Zealand could end up being the most important part of that agreement. New Zealand is a world leader in trade policy as regards to the environment. And I think the UK and New Zealand are very similar minded on this. And so watch kind of what we're doing with New Zealand. That's a live negotiation at the moment, so I can't talk so much about the specifics there. But we could do a lot on trade policy. But trade agreements don't prevent you. Not having a trade agreement doesn't prevent any of this activity taking place. It's unlikely that we're going to be doing new free trade agreements with anybody in Latin America, I would think, that's not one of the first priorities in the first wave. But we shouldn't wait for that. We should be promoting UK sustainable trade within Latin America and sort of providing support for exports. Offshore wind, I think, is a great example, but there's other sectors as well. UK expertise in solar, other environmental technologies are absolutely part of our offer in Latin America, and we've got a great team out there who are working very hard on this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Minister. I'm going to press you later on the connection to the domestic strengths, but I'm going to hand over to Caroline now to give her initial remarks. And if you want to respond to anything the Minister said so far, but we'll come to that later. Caroline, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Angela. Good morning, everyone. I think it's excellent to see that there are so many stakeholders here today interested in how the UK can form a trade policy that advances its environmental ambition, both at home and importantly on the global stage. So my work on environment and trade is largely focused on the multilateral discussions in Geneva. And so from that perspective, I can report that there's a great deal of interest in how the UK will use its independent voice to show leadership on environmentally sustainable trade on the global stage. There's also great expectation that the UK will take leadership, especially in light of its forthcoming presidency of COP26, of the G7, and given its role as a member of the G20. We have many governments who are willing to talk about environmental sustainability and trade, but not many are as large economically as the UK and have the same potential clout on the issue. So at the international level, the discussion on sustainability and trade lags far behind a much more dynamic discussion that you see on sustainable investment and finance, for instance, where the UK is clearly leading the way on promoting a greener and low carbon global economy. But there is positive movement in the trade arena, and so leadership here from the UK would come at a really critical time. Amidst the calls to build back better, as Minister Hands referred to, there's an opportunity to discuss not only trade recovery, but a greener and fairer trade recovery. And here I think it's really critical that we recognise that no country can address the environment and trade challenges we face alone. If the UK did everything perfectly domestically, it wouldn't be enough to help push the transition that we need at the global level to achieve the environmental goals that we have. So governments need to work together to identify approaches that are fair and effective and that balance diverse interests, and particularly of developing countries and the most vulnerable among them. We need to find ways to craft trade policy and process and institutions that enable and support countries to produce, consume and trade more sustainably. And this will demand cooperation through FTAs, as Minister Hands has said, but also multilateral cooperation. And it may not be only through trade deals. There are other ways in which we can foster trade cooperation that will help us on the environment. So one thing I did want to underline is that the last 30 years have underscored that the foundation of sustainable trade policy for any country is coherence at the national level. So this means safeguarding effective and high ambition national environmental policies, laws and institutions, and the scope to raise them over time. But it also means maintaining those standards in the context of trade agreements. And this requires good process and sound democratic oversight. So if we look at the UK's peers around the world, its leading trading partners, they have effective interagency processes to integrate policy making on trade, environment and climate. They have parliamentary review and oversight of negotiating mandates. before negotiations, before deals are ratified, and sometimes during their implementation. They have sustainability impact assessments that are used to inform policymaking objectives. They have opportunities for consultation from a diversity of relevant stakeholders, including the business sector and civil society and academics. And there's a strong role for advisory committees that are transparent, balanced, and have a mandate to provide recommendations to which governments respond. So all of this in other countries requires that stakeholders are engaged and have expertise and are informed. So my appeal, this is not so much to the government directly, but we also need stakeholder organisations that are active and engaged concretely on what kinds of trade policy would make a difference to UK business, to environment, to production overseas. And importantly, no one wants to negotiate with a country where there's a risk of parliamentary rebellion or public backlash at the end, at the final stages, and the whole deal falls through. So the more that we can do to bring the public and the business sector along while we're doing our trade policy negotiations, the better. And my second point is that I think we need to go beyond the status quo in terms of environmental commitments and provisions in agreements. We can all agree, I think, that trade rules need to keep out of the way of environmental standards. They shouldn't undermine them or lead to backsliding. They shouldn't get in the way of measures to implement multilateral environment agreements. But there's also an important positive agenda. What I've referred to so far is more of the defensive one. So we need to look to see how we can use trade law and policy more concretely to incentivize, to support, and to enable more environmentally sustainable production at home and abroad. And I think here the key point, you mentioned UK's success in reducing its carbon footprint, but I understand that WWF, for instance, has published work to show that almost half of the UK's carbon footprint is abroad, is from UK related, it's from the impacts of UK consumption abroad. And so this to me really underlines that we must work with other countries to look at how we can help them reduce their environmental footprint. And that means working with UK business, but also with business in those countries. And so a forward-looking agenda must really put developing countries' sustainability priorities center stage. And this is something we can, that the UK is well positioned to do. You know, many of the LDCs and the small island states are those that are complaining most about the impacts of climate on their exports and on their revenues, on their economies. And many of them are Commonwealth members. Many of them are already recipients of UK's development assistance. So it's great to hear about you mentioning the increase in climate finance. And I think here it would also be really useful for the UK to think about how it can better harness its aid for trade and development assistance to be helping those countries that are keen to invest, to export more sustainably produced products, and to be more engaged in the green exports and to get more value from them. That's the way we'll get the broader global economy moving in the favor of sustainable production, is we help producers elsewhere. I just have two quick final points, Angela, and then I'll leave the rest of the questions. The third thing is, as you mentioned, it's a top priority for global Britain to lead this conversation on trade and climate. And I couldn't, agree more. It's very heartening news. I think there's no country better positioned to break down the silos between climate and trade negotiations. There's a really high business interest in this. The International Chamber of Commerce has come out numerous times saying what it really needs. Business needs a transparent and predictable environment. They need to understand what governments plan to do on climate and trade. But I think you mentioned also New Zealand. So a key thing that would give the UK credibility in this space is if it joined negotiations that New Zealand is leading for an agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability. We can talk more about that later. And also that if it joined the Friends of Fossil Fuel Reform at the WTO. This is a group of countries that are committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and to use WTO processes to improve monitoring and transparency of them. So finally, I think the UK can and should use its voice at the WTO to support the environmental agenda there. But I think I'll come back to that in the Q&A afterwards. But I must say it's so heartening to hear you speak so favourably and supportively of the need for environmental action. I must say there are very few trade ministers who do on the global stage. And what we lack most is political leadership from any trade ministers speaking up on this. So that's really welcome.
Thank you, Caroline. I've just got a few questions that I just want to follow up on it. And Caroline, I think, made the point very well there, that there's an amazing opportunity. 21st Trade Agenda is starting to look at the environment in a way it hasn't for a long time. And as you said, Minister, the UK with COP, hosting COP, and with it the first country passing a climate change act, the world is looking at us to be with an independent trade policy at the vanguard of taking things forward. That comes with a expectation, I think, of parliamentary scrutiny with civic involvement. Minister, can you speak to what the ambition is and what process you think we need in trade policy in the UK to get there, to take the 21st century agenda?
Well, thanks, and I welcome everything that Carolyn said, and I welcome that question. Look, involving civil society and Parliament in trade policy is absolutely crucial. Trade policy, if you're not careful, you can get lost in the world of quotas, tariffs, technical barriers to trade, all of the kind of the jargon of trade, and become detached from the purpose. The purpose of trade is to raise our prosperity in a way that is sustainable, broadly speaking. And to do that, we need to find what are things that will benefit UK exporters, what would be the things that will benefit UK consumers, and doing it all in a sustainable way. And to do that, we have to listen and interact with stakeholders. And that's why we set up a very important structure on stakeholder engagement with our strategic trade advisory group and our sector teams with sector advisory groups, one of which is on sustainability, which I met with, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Some of you, I think, may even be on that advisory group. So making sure that we speak to, and we've got different advisory groups by different sectors. There's one on agriculture, for example, etc. So making sure that we engage regularly with stakeholders is going to be vital, because otherwise, if we don't know what people want from trade policy, and that may be anything from an exporter seeking a lower tariff on their goods going into Japan, say, through to those who want to see our trade policy moved in a particular direction. So here on environmental sustainability, we need to be open and have good outreach to everybody on that. And Parliament's also a massively important part of that. Carolyn is right. Parliament, our trading partners will need to know that a trade agreement is going to command broad support. And that is why at all stages we have, when we've launched, I've got 4 simultaneous more or less simultaneous negotiations going on at the moment with the United States, with Japan, with Australia and New Zealand. And what we've done for each one has been publish our negotiation objectives, a scoping analysis. We've kept Parliament updated with written ministerial statements. We did an oral statement on the US launch, for example, written ministerial statements as we go along. And I do very, very regular Zoom calls and webinars with MPs across all parties. Yesterday we had a whole day's debate on the trade bill. So making sure that Parliament is involved at all stages is absolutely crucial for us as well. And making sure that trade policy benefits all parts of the UK is also an important part of that as well. So MPs play a key role in that too.
Thank you, Minister. I mean, I hear what you're saying about the various STAG and ETAG groups. I think I'll pass to Caroline to set out what is kind of gold standard in terms of stakeholder and parliamentary engagement, and how that, I would say, differs from what the UK is using as its process so far in the first trade agreements it takes forward. Caroline, do you want to comment on that? Oh, you're on mute now, sorry.
Sorry. Thanks. Yeah, I mentioned some of them before. I mean, I think the key thing we always come back to is effective interagency processes within ministries first. In terms of parliamentary review, I mean, it varies among countries, but the leading countries are ones where the government has a negotiating mandate that's signed off first by Parliament. So in that sense, the UK would set out its environmental objectives very clearly, and then it could be held accountable to them by Parliament afterwards. There's always a sensitivity about how much governments can keep parliaments informed during the negotiating process, because of course there are many details along the way, and that these are often, there are reasons that they are kept private. But certainly governments abroad report regularly to parliaments about the deals, and there's an opportunity to vote before they are ratified. And also, I think there's an increasing push to review their implementation afterwards, so that once, if something's going wrong after a year and things are not in place, are there mechanisms by which Parliament can intervene and ask for changes or ask for improvements. I think the other key thing is sustainability impact assessments. Obviously, the EU is a world leader in those, so the UK until recently has benefited from that capacity. But there's incredible methodological work and expertise there in the EU and also in the US that could be built on. And the other element is to have advisory committees, as I mentioned before, that have broad consultation, that are transparent, and that have a clear mandate to provide recommendations over the long term to government in these areas.
And Caroline, if I stay with you for a second, I mean, you talked about the opportunities to manage defensive issues, and then opportunities to actually take trade forward. The UK's WTO seat is an opportunity for us to do something quite different, and that this is potentially a place that could require a bit of bravery. The UK's first trade policy, we might actually be setting out some things that might breach of current regulations and have to be testing and pushing the envelope. Is that what we need to do in order to start to expand the scope of environmental policy, which hasn't been the WTO's strong point up to this point, but they seem to be indicating they've got an appetite to have test cases and rule differently in the future. What do you think the UK needs to do to sort of start stretching this envelope and creating new space for environmental policy?
Okay, well, I think so. Firstly, thank you for the question. I think that the UK can and should use its voice at the WTO. I'm not sure that it needs to do so in a way that that is aggressive in the sense of new test cases and so on. WTO rules actually give tremendous scope for countries to act in favour of the environment. It simply asks that when they do so, they apply the same rules domestically as to foreign producers, and that they don't discriminate among foreign producers. So the UK can come up with whatever standard it likes, as long as it applies that equally at home and abroad and to the range of trading partners, it can go for it. Right? So I think that's really important to note. Now, it's not to say there are not countries that are dissuaded from doing so because they fear retaliation. But legally speaking, the WTO dispute settlement system has upheld the right of countries to take those measures under WTO rules. So I think that's really important, that it's not waving a big stick over them. I think what's more important is how we can get WTO rules to do more to help countries be more environmentally sustainable, and also and use the rules that are already there. So one of them is we can use rules that are already there around subsidies to remove environmentally harmful subsidies. We could equally use them to help countries cooperate to remove environmentally harmful fossil fuel subsidies. So those rules are there, they're strong, they're enforceable. So that's something that governments could use. I think that we need to ensure that environmental sustainability is a core priority in the WTO reform agenda and for whoever is the new Director General. There is, as you mentioned, new political interest in reasserting the importance of environment in trade. So there's a proposal at the moment for an ambitious ministerial statement on environmental sustainability in trade. It will be the first time in 25 years that members have explicitly spoken up at the ministerial level on environmental sustainability. And the idea is there is to try and enable more focused and action-oriented dialogue on specific environmental topics. And so here there are many areas where the WTO where the UK could support and promote specific discussions that are already underway among members on how trade and trade policy frameworks could better support environmental action. So one is on climate. There's a few murmurings around the edges, but countries are very nervous. And what we need is a way of saying we need a multilateral discussion about this. We need to acknowledge that there are enormous concerns about protectionism, about competitiveness, about how it will impact developing countries, about how the poorest will fare. And so the UK can play a really unique role in bringing that conversation together. And there's a package of different climate issues that we could look at underneath that, some of which are of more interest to developing countries and some which are really ones that we need to go to battle somewhat with the largest industrial powers over. But there's a constellation of issues, but we shouldn't avoid all of them because they're hard. We can make progress on some of them. And the other thing is there's exciting discussions underway on the circular economy and efforts to reduce plastic pollution. There's trade in environmental goods and services, sustainable agriculture. There's also scope to, as I mentioned before, to boost to green aid for trade and trade finance, which is something that's really important to getting developing countries on board on this agenda. And there's lots of specific negotiating areas around, there's negotiations underway around government procurement and how to have more sustainable procurement rules. There's all kinds of specific trade policy measures that could be taken. I'll stop there, sorry.
Thank you, Caroline. Just to give the Minister one last opportunity to respond to that, then we're going to go to questions. So if you have any questions you'd like to upvote and make sure they're there, Gwen will look at those in a second. But Minister, just on the points that Caroline was raising there, the UK is, I think, probably quite unique in having a climate change act, in having quite a radical agricultural policy, public money for public goods, which is moving the subsidy regime away from what most countries have, which is a subsidy regime that doesn't support sustainability in farming. And we have therefore got this opportunity to take forward some legislation and show that we are being even-handed with our domestic producers and potential exporters to the UK, and actually take that forward. How are you thinking about the WTO environmental statement, things like the agreement for climate change, trade and sustainability, and those other ways that the UK might signal its intention to be a leader on environmental trade policy?
Yeah, well, thanks, Angela. Well, a couple of things, and then very keen to throw it open for questions. First of all, is the UK is looking forward to taking a big role at the WTO. Obviously, we're a founding member of GATT back in 1947 or 48, and we have operated the WTO until January through our EU membership. Obviously, we remain subject to things like EU trade policy till the end of the year, but the UK will be a strong voice at the WTO, and I hope a leading voice as the world's 5th largest economy and one of the best internationally connected countries in the world, with a fantastic global diplomatic network and a great ambassador at Geneva and Julian Braithwaite. Really looking forward to taking a big role at the WTO, being a strong voice for the environment and trade and sustainability, broadly speaking. And they're, working with like-minded countries. I've already mentioned New Zealand, but being influential with larger economies as well, such as Japan, such as the United States, such as the European Union, India, Brazil, all of the big players of the World Trade Organization. We are looking forward to being a strong voice on. Just a little bit, just in terms of other things, I think Caroline mentioned sustainability impact assessments. These are some things that we are publishing as part of our negotiating objectives for our free trade agreements. And also, when we bring back the final agreement, that will also include an impact assessment on the environment as well in those agreements. So that is very much also something at the core of our trade policy, particularly as we relate to Parliament. So I almost certainly didn't even answer 10% of what Caroline said, but let's, I'll try and perhaps answer a little bit more as we take sort of public questions.
That will be lovely. Thank you, Minister. Gwen, I can see there's lots of questions in the box. Would you like to tell us which ones are the most popular amongst the audience today? What would you like to put, what I can put to the Minister or to Caroline?
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, so we've had a huge flurry of questions in, and we had a couple submitted before the event as well. From a scan, it looks like they're sort of grouped into a few different areas. So we've got questions relating to climate, which we've already touched on quite a lot, scrutiny of trade deals by MPs, and then also quite a few questions relating to standards in terms of food, antibiotics, pesticides, that kind of thing. As we've been touching on climate already, I feel like maybe it might make sense to kind of stick with that to start with and then move on to those other themes. One of the biggest or the most popular questions in the Q&A at the moment also relates to a question that we had submitted beforehand, which was from Adam McGibbon at Global Witness, and that's about UK export finance. So obviously it was great to hear from the Minister earlier that there's going to be a revised export strategy, but this question is, via UK export finance, this government has committed over £1 billion in support of new fossil fuel development in Mozambique. What assessment has your department made for the alignment between this and the UK's commitments under the Paris Agreement? And as part of Global Britain's future trade policy, will the Minister and his government announce an end to UK support of overseas fossil fuel projects?
Minister, that's one for you.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, in terms of Mozambique, the UK, first of all, the UK Export Finance provides, I've already mentioned the finance that it provides for renewable projects around the world. I mentioned Taiwan, I mentioned solar in Spain. So we need to see it in the context of an overall mix of energy support. In terms of Mozambique, what we are doing there is teaming up with other export credit agencies from around the world. I believe Japan, Italy, South Africa, the Netherlands, Thailand, and the World Bank and IMF have indicated they're supportive of this project. We need to make sure that it is done in as environmentally friendly a way that it can be.
Oh, we've lost your voice, Minister. Okay, I think you're back.
Okay, sorry. We need to make sure that the project is done in a sustainable way as possible, and I think having the UK in that consortium will help to move and influence that in the right direction. I think overall, in terms of fossil fuel support, I think this is a key part of a UK policy objective, making sure that we move towards supporting more renewables projects. I think is going to be a key part of that, making sure we get a better diversity in that energy mix as we go forward.
Thank you, Minister. And I think just to note some of the comments in the chat, there is quite a long way to go, because I think it's over 98% of UK export finance currently goes to fossil fuel projects in lower middle income countries. And that is a big move to move towards renewables. So I won't say any more on that, but Gwen, can I go back to you for next question?
Yes, so another on the climate theme, which is about, I guess, flipping it into this positive, how can we be seen as a global leader? And something Carolyn mentioned earlier was that there are sort of innovative agreements happening on trade and climate. And one of those is the New Zealand initiative, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, called the ACT negotiations. Will the UK seek to join this trade agreement, which brings together climate change, trade and sustainability development agendas?
So very quickly, Minister and Caroline, are we going to join? And Caroline, would that be a good first step for the UK if it wants to be a leader? Minister,
very interested in this space. Watch this space in terms of our talks with New Zealand. We're obviously we're right in the middle of the first round of our free trade agreement negotiations with New Zealand. We're very interested in this space. We're watching that very, very closely. Obviously, we don't have a fully independent trade policy until the 1st of January. I also have to look at the capacity in my department. I've already got a full simultaneous trade talks underway at the moment. I don't think any major country or even minor country has ever done that before. Quite often, different agreements there's negotiations going on all around the world on all kinds of different trade agreements. This is a very, very good one that is really very important for our agenda. But I also have to be mindful of the capacity in the department for doing too many or simultaneous negotiations at once. But be assured, in our conversations both at Geneva and with New Zealand, that we are very, very interested in this space.
Caroline, do you want to add to what this opportunity could afford the UK?
Yeah, just to mention that the ACT negotiations are focusing on 3 areas. Oh, sorry.
No, it's now working. You're on mute now. There you are.
Okay. Sorry, just to say that the ACT negotiations are focusing on 3 areas that have come up so far in the discussion. So one is on environmental goods and services, which is something that climate-friendly goods and services that Minister Hands has already said is a top UK priority. The second one is around climate-related labelling, so things like labelling of carbon content and so on. And the third is around fossil fuel subsidies, which, I mean, Angela has pushed on that. But I imagine that all of these issues will arise in the UK's negotiations with New Zealand anyway. So hopefully that will provide an opening through which the UK could join the ACT negotiations as well. And having spoken to some of the negotiators there, I also understand that they'll be open to observers to the negotiations as well. So that could be an interim step for the UK. to observe those as a way of understanding more if there are capacity constraints. I would just underline that I think symbolically, in terms of the UK's credibility as an actor on climate and trade, this is the hottest game in town. It's really the place that's seen as a pathway for future work on trade and climate at the international level. And so being seen to be an active supporter of those negotiations would really buy the UK a lot of credibility in other multilateral discussions on climate and trade where it would like to take leadership.
Thank you, Caroline. Gwen, I think we've got time for 2 quick questions or 1 big one, depending what you've got.
Yeah, so I think it would be great to move on to standards, and the highest upvoted question in the Q&A box is from Sean Spears, and it's, for the avoidance of doubt, why won't the government put into law its manifesto commitment not to compromise on environment, animal welfare and food standards, i.e. in non-regression from the current standards?
Yeah, let me talk about standards, because there's a large amount of misinformation. Look, these standards are already protected in law. For example, we will take over the current EU standards in relation to things like animal welfare, food safety, and key parts of the environment. You know, there'd have to be a legal change after the 1st of January for those standards to be under threat. So, you know, they already are in law. We don't need to put into a new law what is already in law there to start with. That is, put simply, why we don't put this on the face of the trade bill. But our manifesto commitment was absolutely clear: no compromise on our high standards of animal welfare, food safety, and the environment. And have a look at what we've been doing in the trade agreements that we've already been doing. So the EU's own trade agreements, where the UK is seeking continuity of those, we have signed more than 20 of those, and not a single one of those 20, nobody's been able to say or point out any diminution of standards in any of the key areas. So the UK absolutely committed to a high regime of standards. What we can't do, though, is what has been promoted, for example, yesterday in the trade bill. There are amendments down on the trade bill which attracted quite a few MPs voting for them, which seeks to extraterritorially have standards. Now, of course, the UK can persuade others, for example, to improve their standards of animal welfare. But what we can't do, and Caroline would know from the WTO, you cannot impose your standards on another market. We can maintain very high domestic standards. We can maintain very high import standards. But what I can't say is that some of the amendments that were put down yesterday for other countries to dynamically align their standards with the UK, otherwise we wouldn't allow in their products. And this is directed at certain US farm and agriculture practices, which most of the people on this call will be aware of. But the unintended consequence of that would be that every single import into the UK under some of these amendments, we would have to be able to say that those goods were produced to at least as good standards as we have in the UK. Now, I wouldn't be able to say that the cocoa we import from Ghana or the Ivory Coast is produced to as good, if not better, environmental standards, labour standards, animal welfare standards for things like the chickens we currently import from Thailand. You know, we can put in high import standards and we will maintain those high import standards. What I can't do is legislate in UK law for how other countries do their standards domestically. So we need to be both knowledgeable and realistic here. That would basically kill off a large part of imports coming into the UK, which is not in the national interest. We're only 67% self-sufficient in food. You know, we currently have to import food. Killing off all UK food imports in this way, in some of the more extreme amendments that we put down, which I think be really unhelpful as we go forward. So we've got to be both realistic and be good advocates globally for change, but we have to be realistic in what we can and cannot achieve.
Minister, thank you for that answer. And you've reiterated the manifesto promise, and obviously your department have reiterated that many times. I think there is still a lot of concern because, as you say, import standards, which are commuted over from the EU and are in law, are in secondary legislation and can be easily changed. And there is live discussion in the US negotiations, most notably, around making things that were currently illegal not illegal, and then potentially keeping them out of the UK market via a dual tariff. And so that raises disquiet and concern that we might be changing the law, and it is so easy to do so in secondary legislation that I think the confidence that you've given us that this is not the intention needs to be supported in some other way than just reiteration of the same promise, I feel.
Well, look, I mean, I dispute some of the premise there, Angela. You're talking there about a live negotiation with the United States, but we've been absolutely clear to the United States, as we've been clear to all of our trade agreement negotiation partners, that there will be no UK compromise on these standards. They're set out in law. We have the manifesto commitment. I don't think Parliament would vote to allow in chlorinated chicken or hormone-enhanced beef. Even if a government in the future would come along with a different manifesto commitment that did want to do it, I don't think Parliament would vote for it. I don't think public opinion would be there either.
I agree. I agree. I think Parliament wouldn't vote for it, and I don't think public opinion is there. But unfortunately, the process we have around trade means that parliamentary vote would not happen, and the public don't get a say. Well, so I think that's why the concern persists. But I don't want to. We won't continue on that point. But I think it is shown by the interest by the audience. It is one where I think more reassurance is needed. I'm going to let you both sum up now and invite you to say whatever you'd like to say as a result of the conversation we've had, which has been really interesting. Particularly would be, I suppose, interested in your reflections, Minister, on the UK's first trade deal in 50 years. Could happen in 2020 or early 21. I'm going to put the EU to the side, assume we have a EU future agreement of some kind. The first new trade agreement, what do you want that agreement to say about global Britain, particularly in relation to the environment, and what mechanisms are you looking at to make that interesting and exciting for the vision that you set out? And Caroline, to you, I think, what are trade experts hoping for from that first deal from the UK? What would you see in it that would make you feel that we're on the track that you outlined? So I'm going to start with Caroline, and I'll let the Minister close. So your quick final comments.
Great, that's a huge question, Angela, to finish up with. I think a first deal would have to be one that looked good for the environment, would have to be one that set out a positive agenda on climate, things that were new in agreements that we haven't seen before, whether that's around things like low carbon, lower tariffs for low carbon goods into the UK. We could also have clarification, I think, on these production and process methods questions. This is what it all gets down to. Whatever the law says, it's clear that there's a lot of confusion about the extent to which we're able to regulate and businesses and governments are able to differentiate between products based on production and process methods. And whether it's on biodiversity, on natural resources, on commodity imports, carbon, it comes back to the same issues around sustainable production across so many different sectors. And so this is something that we really need to get to get a handle on. And this can be by clear rules and around things like labelling, around government procurement that favours sustainability, the scope to use local content requirements, how the government intends to apply rules around its tariff schedules to favour greener products as well. I think I should leave it there for the moment, Angela.
That's a very good and long list to achieve in our first trade deal. Minister, what does your first trade deal that the UK signs as an independent nation, what does it say about global Green Britain?
Well, I think first of all, Angela, I think it will show that the UK, the important principle on trade in general, that shows that the UK will be an important player with its independent trade policy going forward, the world's 5th largest economy. For a lot of the trade partners we're talking to at the moment, this will be one of their largest trade agreements, or potentially their largest trade agreement. In the United States, for example, we will become, to do a trade agreement with the United Kingdom, we would become overnight the largest economy that the US would have a free trade agreement with. So this is important in terms of not just ours, but also our partners as well. I think the most important thing on the environment is to work with what is possible. Different trade partners approach things in different ways, and we shouldn't have a blanket one-size-fits-all. I've already mentioned New Zealand, where I think we can be very, very innovative. Australia takes a rather different view. The United States, of course, the current administration has quite a different view to the UK on man-made climate change and the Paris Agreement. But we should look at what we can do with the United States. If you look at the USMCA agreement that the United States has with Canada and Mexico, there's large chapters in there on environmental sustainability, stuff like anything from sustainable logging through to water rules. And you know, just because the US has a different attitude on climate change doesn't prevent us from doing things with different trade partners in different ways. It's always a question on a bilateral agreement of what both sides are going to be happy with going with. And that is the case for all of our trade partners. We'll be doing a lot with Japan also, so making sure the environment is a key and important part of all of those trade agreements, but it won't necessarily be in exactly the same way. But more broadly, I think we'll see the UK returning to the world stage as an independent player in international trade and pushing these agendas very, very hard.
Thank you, Minister. I just want to now sum up by thanking you, the first DIT Minister, who's really had a kind of a session on the environment. It's been such a hot topic. We're so pleased that you've been able to spend the time this morning. Thank you, Caroline, for your comments and suggestions on a route forward. Thank you to the event who put it together, and thank you all for joining us. This session has been recorded and will be available on YouTube later today. And I said at the top, there's a number of other Greener UK events this week, Das Gupta on Thursday. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. We look forward to further conversations on trade and that great first trade deal that the Minister outlined. Thank you very much.